we didn't know what we were going to be up against. But we were about 30, maybe a little over 30 days, we were at this place called Ant Hill Plains, which was a field the Australians had dug out of the bush out there, out of Townsville. And we did quite a lot of flying out of there, but I don't remember any training at all by the squadron commander or the old hands, maneuvers or what you're going to do when you meet the Japanese. We just heard you can outdive them, and nobody said anything too bad. As a matter of fact, there was a story around about how the Japanese pilots were afraid of the P-39 as compared to the 40. Well, of course, that was ridiculous, but we didn't know that. So we went over there still with quite a lot of confidence when we went to New Guinea. And by the way, when we went to New Guinea, we followed a C-47 was our guide from Townsville over to New Guinea, and we flew up to a place called Horn Island, which is up at the end of Australia, stayed overnight there, and then took off from there to go to Port Moresby. And we got within about 5 or 10 miles of Port Moresby following this C-47, and he turned around and told us we had to go back because they were bombing the field at that time. So we came back to Horn Island, stayed another night, and then the next day we went into Port Moresby. That was our introduction to Port Moresby, which was bombed just about every day when we first got there. And we were at a place called 7 Mile Strip there at Port Moresby, which was, the strips were all named by the distance from Port Moresby, and we were at 7 Mile, our first trip up there. And we were scrambled about every day, and it was probably almost a week before we actually had any contact with the Japanese. They were always above us. We never reached them. We couldn't reach the bombers, and the Zeros we weren't attacked by Zeros. The day I remember particularly was on June 16th, I believe it was. There was 12 of us flying at about 12,000 feet, and we saw the Japanese up above us, the Zeros. It was a beautiful day, and we were all in formation. We probably looked pretty good if you were just going to look at us, but these Japanese formed a Lufberry circle at about 20,000 feet. And I remember they had big red nose cones, and they circled in this circle, and you could tell what they were going to do. And pretty soon they started peeling off, and it was just we couldn't do anything. My squadron commander, I was flying on the squadron commander's wing, and he was shot. I never did see the Zero that shot him, but he was shot in the elbow, and he did get back to the base, and we lost 3 planes. In that particular skirmish, we didn't get any. I remember looking up at one of the planes that was shot down, and there was a Zero right on his tail, and the pieces were flying off of the airplane, and just flying along straight and level. The pilot must have been already dead, I guess, probably. And I got into a cloud. There were some light cumulus clouds, and I got into a cloud. Never did see any of the planes except for the one on this tail of the P-39. Never did see any of the Zeros. I guess I was just lucky they didn't come after me. And that was my first encounter, and that put the fear of God in me. I was a veteran flyer after that day, and we sure respected the Japanese and the Zeros. I learned later, I didn't know at that time, that 3 of the top aces of Japan were flying out of Leh at that time.
There were 3 planes from our squadron, 3 planes from the 380th, and we were to join 12 from the 428th. And this is not the kind of a setup we like. We liked it much better when all 18 were from one squadron. But that day I was supposed to have the day off. My crew and I were supposed to have the day off. And our squadron already had 18 planes out on another mission. And then they drummed up this mission as a last-minute kind of thing and patched us together and sent us out. Well, I was going to have the highest. I was to be at 12,500. Lead flight was to be at 10.5, if I remember correctly, and the number 3 flight was to be at, number 2 flight was to be at 8,500. So we were 3 different altitudes, and I was at the highest. And so it was my determination, I'm not going to get my flight over those below me. And so at the initial point, I made the turn in such a way that it placed me well behind the other 2 flights. And it seemed to me on that bomb run, oh, and by the way, I had also decided that I was not going to do what we usually did, as we were discussing it earlier. As soon as the bombs were away, we normally made a diving turn, and it was usually, if we were on a coastal target, we'd head out to sea. That's a logical thing to do, get away from the anti-aircraft fire. But I decided on this occasion, because the gunners on the ground anticipate we're going to go that way, I'm planning on making a climbing turn to the left instead of a diving turn to the right. Well, it seemed to me that it was taking unusually long to hear from the bombardier bombs away. We had had a problem in that plane with the intercom. I thought, well, maybe the intercom isn't functioning. And I was getting very anxious because it seemed to me we should have released our bombs. Now, if the air is smooth and you don't have flak bursting underneath you, close underneath you, then you can feel it when 4,000 pounds of bombs leave the airplane. It lifts up some. You can feel it. Well, I hadn't felt that. I don't remember if there was turbulence. Turbulence will feel the same way. Flak bursting underneath you close will feel the same way. So I didn't know whether we had dropped our bombs or not, but I was getting anxious. And I finally decided I'm not going to turn left and climb. By the way, I could see by that time that the other 2 flights had dropped their bombs. They were already turned out to sea, and they were well ahead of me. So I decided, no, instead of making a climbing turn left, I'm going to make my diving turn right. Well, did get the word bombs away, and so I immediately started a diving turn to the right. And it seemed like it was only moments after I started that turn that the airplane seemed to stop in midair and shudder. And as I recall, it was as if there were a brilliant light shining, and all this seemed to be taking some time, both this shuddering of the airplane and this light, but it was probably just an instant of time. And my right hand had been on the throttles, but I found my right hand in my lap. And as I looked down at my arm, I could see bone in the upper part of my arm and bone in the lower part of my arm. And I couldn't really tell other than some raw meat holding my hand together with the rest of the arm. I turned the controls over to the co-pilot, but he just flew straight and in a slight descent. And we're still within anti-aircraft range. So I took over the controls. And by the way, there was nobody else around us at that time. So I did evasive action that was really much more violent than was needed. Steeper climbing, steeper dives, steeper turns. And continued that till we were far enough out to sea that there's no question about anti-aircraft reaching us. So I turned the controls back to my co-pilot. He couldn't see out of his side of the windshield very well. There were holes in it, there was hydraulic fluid, there was blood, there were pieces of bone and pieces of flesh, mine. And he slid his window open on the right side and stuck his head out. Going over 200 miles an hour, that's not a very wise thing to do. He pulled his head back in, closed his window, didn't stick it out again. Well, I could tell that there were a lot of things. Oh, the next thing, I guess, was when I called for my bombardier to come give me first aid. But instead of his doing it, my navigator was the one who began giving me first aid. He sprinkled sulfa on my wound. They could not find the first aid kit. He took his belt off, just a regular GI belt, and used that as a tourniquet. And some of the time that belt hurt worse than the wound did. But he kept that on as long as needed there. And I recalled his getting a tube of morphine, breaking the glass off of that, and I was quite sure he'd given me a shot of morphine, but it didn't seem to affect me at all. A few years ago, I saw him again, and I asked him, "Did you give me a shot of morphine? Because it didn't seem to do anything for me." He said, "We gave you 2, and we thought it'd knock you out, and it didn't seem to faze you at all." On our way back, we ran into some of the same clouds that had interfered a little bit on our way up, and I was a little concerned about the possibility of our letting down into the mountains of Corsica. They reach about 8,500 feet, and instead of my navigator navigating, he'd been giving me first aid, so I wasn't sure where we were precisely. And we did break out under the clouds, still north of the island of Corsica, and knew exactly where we were, so navigating was no problem from then on. The first fields were fighter fields. They were British and French fighter fields, and their runways were shorter, but also we preferred to get to an American base if possible. And the first B-25 base was the 340th, and that was quite a bit closer than ours was, so that's where we intended to land. As we were approaching to land, and I turned back into the navigator's compartment, called for them to pump down the landing gear. The J had a hydraulic emergency system compared to a mechanical one that had been on the earlier models. And instead of that lever requiring a lot of effort to move, just nothing to move it, it'd just go back and forth without any effort whatsoever, because that too had been knocked out. So there was no way that we could get the landing gear down. Oh, and I'd failed to mention that in the bottom of the fuselage, there was a lot of 100-octane gasoline. Gasoline was running from the left wing down into the fuselage. And years later, I learned from my bombardier that he said he had gasoline up over the top of his knees. Not that the gasoline was that deep, but it had been deep enough that the lower part of his trousers had been in it, and it had wicked its way up so that it was up over his knees. So that's somewhat of an indication of the hazards that are involved here. Every time I'd look into the navigator's compartment, I'd see a fog of fumes. So only a spark would have been necessary to bring about an explosion. And with that 100-octane gasoline, a belly landing wasn't exactly a desirable thing. But we were too low then to give the crew any choice. Ordinarily, in that circumstance, you would give the crew the choice. Do you want to bail out, or do you want to ride in with us? Because the hazards were so great as far as the landing was concerned. Well, we were too low, and with just the limited power on the one engine, to say nothing of the poor condition. Well, I hadn't even mentioned my co-pilot was wounded too. I didn't know it at the time, but he was wounded, and he wasn't feeling it, but he was losing strength in his left leg in particular. At any rate, going around, trying to get altitude enough for crew to bail out was just out of the question. Well, one thing that we used to do as a standard thing in the States as we were training was there would always be somebody who would call off airspeed for the pilot, so he could just look out at the runway, wouldn't have to keep glancing in at the airspeed indicator. And we'd gotten away from that totally in combat. But my navigator put his left hand on the back of my seat, right hand on the co-pilot's seat. Over my shoulder, he was calling off airspeed, which was very helpful, but not a very good position for a person to be in for a crash landing. Well, and prior to his doing that, when he realized that we couldn't get the landing gear down, he released the top hatch. The top hatch is between the pilot and co-pilot and just back of us a little ways. And the reason for releasing it in flight was that normally in a B-25, you go out the bottom of the airplane. And you can't get out the bottom when you're resting on it. And if you crash land with your escape hatches in place, they could be jammed by a twisting of the fuselage. So it was much better to get rid of the escape hatch before landing in that circumstance. And that's what he did. He released the escape hatch. And he also fired a Very flare, which may have been hazardous in a way, but I'm sure that he held his hand up high enough into the airstream that he wasn't too fearful that it was going to cause an explosion of these fumes. The Very flare, red flare, was so that the ambulance crew on the base would know they're wounded on board. Well, as we were approaching the runway, for the first time, I throttled back the right engine a little bit. Oh, I failed to say, we weren't able to get the flaps down by the emergency system. Whether or not the handle had been shot away or whether it had been lost, I don't know what. But they just had tried to crank them down. This was done behind the bomb bay, and they were not able to get the flaps down, which simply meant that we would stall at a higher speed. We had to have a higher speed right down to touchdown. Well, I throttled back a little bit on that right engine, and I was using my left hand on the yoke, my feet on the rudder pedals, and my co-pilot, remember, could not see out of his windshield well. And I'm not sure whether he tried to see as much as he could looking ahead or whether he was just looking out the side. But also, I never liked the way he landed anyway. He almost always would touch down at a too slow a speed. When you are coming in behind the prop washer of preceding airplanes, I always like to have a higher speed right until we touch down so that we'd have better control if we were hitting the turbulent air. But he'd make a nice landing of the state type of landing where you had nobody up in front of you. It's fine to just get it down to a stall as you touch down. But he was pulling back on his yoke, and I was looking at the boulders at the far end of the runway, coming pretty rapidly, it appeared. I was pushing forward, he was pulling back. I yelled at him, let's get this thing down. He relaxed the back pressure right after I'd heard the call of 135 as the airspeed. And we touched down so gently that none of us recall any jolt whatsoever. And my navigator, who was standing there with his hands on our seats, was not thrown off his feet. And I am fairly sure that he got out on the nose of the airplane before we had come to a complete stop. I was reaching up to turn off the master switch and the magneto switch for the right engine, and he stepped on my hand going out over the windshield. And so a few years ago when I saw him, I asked him, were you out on the nose before we came to a complete stop? He says, I think I may have been. He didn't know for sure, but he was moving quickly. My crew was not a crew of eager beavers, but they moved very quickly that day, getting out of that airplane. And my crews were smokers too, but I heard one of them yell, get out of here, that cigarette. Somebody was approaching our plane with a lighted cigarette, and here we had that 100-octane gasoline and all those fumes that could have gone up so easily. Well, there was no fire, there was no explosion, I was going to say no damage. There was minimal damage done by our landing, so that later in the hospital, the engineering officer from the 340th came and said, if we hadn't had to drag the airplane off over some boulders because of other emergency landings coming in, we could have jacked that plane up and repaired it, and it could have been flown again. But as it was not flown again. So all of us survived through a situation that was very precarious, to say the least. And why God spared us, I don't know. But part of the reason is so we could do this today.
You take somebody who's never done it except practice missions and put them in a serious thing where a loser dies. That's what we found ourselves in. On top of that, we found ourselves with the horrible weather in England, and generally year-round, but especially in the winter. And so we're, mission after mission, we're flying in terrible weather condition. And we flew, generally, our first missions were all escort for 8th Air Force heavy bombers. And that meant we rendezvoused at 25 or 30,000 feet. Almost 99% of the time, that meant we had to take off, join up, and then fly through 25,000 feet of clouds to get to top, or a lot of them. It wouldn't go clear up there. If it did, it'd be a thunderhead and you're in trouble. But we had a lot of weather problems. One of my very first sightings of an enemy aircraft was a 109 who crossed in front of me. I turned and got headed towards him in a steep bank left, and all of a sudden he started coming apart, and I hadn't fired my guns yet, and it was Glenn Eagleston coming in from the other side had hit him. Glenn used to tell me all the time, "I owe you one." He says, we almost were air scoop to air scoop when he finally hit him. You see them. Dogfights are funny things. They're huge. They might go all over the sky. You lose track of your own people. Hopefully your wingman stays with you. If he doesn't, then you're in trouble, because you not only have to watch what you're doing, you have to watch behind you. People who don't check six are in deep trouble. They won't be victor, they'll be victim. I don't know what you can say about it. You ease into it. Fortunately, I didn't get into a huge dogfight on my first mission, although I think I'm good enough that I would have survived. Who knows? We were out on a search and destroy mission. I was leading a flight of 4 planes. I had 8 planes, but couldn't find enough targets, so I sent 4 of them off one area, and we went to another, and I found 6 German trucks on the road. And we stopped them. We went in strafing and set 4 of them on fire on the first pass and pulled up. I had not seen any return fire, so I went back to get the other 2. And when I went back the second time, my wingman, who normally would be flying in a finger 4 formation on my right, was excited and got out in front of me. So we burned the other 2 trucks, but I was 10 feet off the ground, and I couldn't turn right because he's in my way, and I can't turn left or poor tail end Charlie will be drug in the ground. So I just held it there and waved him back. And as we're waiting, I find myself going across a open field with 100 German soldiers on their knees with rifles firing at us. And probably they came from the trucks we'd burned. And we laughed about it. We were able, finally, we pulled up and got away, pulled from that area, and started counting holes in the airplane. And I counted 8 in mine, in right wing, left wing, and 1 through the engine. And a P-51 will not take a lot of punishment. If you lose your coolant, you're done. So, and I lost my coolant. I got up to 8,000 feet, and the coolant temperature hit the red peg, and there was no way. I began to lose power. I had already set course for home. I started calling for Mayday for a fix. I pulled the red handle and the canopy flew off just like they told me it would. You haven't got time for the story. I had made 4 attempts to get out, each one a joke. First, when I started to jump and I had my shoulder straps laying on my shoulder, pulled me back. I picked up the microphone, said goodbye, undid the shoulder straps, made another jump. I hit the end of the radio cord, couldn't get back, drop back in. As long as I was back, I said goodbye, unplugged the radio, made a third attempt, and got my head out. I'm going 100 miles an hour, 105 maybe, and the wind caught my goggles and pulled them out about a foot from my head. I pulled my head back, and they snapped back, and I dropped back down in the seat. So I plugged the radio in and said goodbye, took the helmet off, and 4th try I got out. Found myself hanging very quietly over a tank battle down below me. Quiet up in the air, no sound in the air, but a lot of sound, gunfire, both heavy and light gunfire down below. And I was going down. I didn't know where. I'd been told I was east of Metz, and the Germans still held Metz. So the last thing they told me before I jumped was, "You 40 miles to go, can you make it?" And I said 40 yards maybe, but that's it. And I jumped. Then I get on the ground. I hid under a bush. A German half-track pulled into the field, and 2 soldiers with rifles were looking for me. I thought, well, they know I'm here, so I stood up and put my hand up. Got halfway there, and I noticed that over the German Iron Cross was a crudely painted white star, and they were a captured vehicle, and they were part of Patton's Third Army, and they were 40 miles ahead of where people thought they were, and so I got a ride with them. I got back a little ways riding in the half-track. Then the commanding officer, colonel, in his armored jeep picked me up and took me to his headquarters for the night, an old German farmhouse that he said, "We're going to stop here for the night." They walked in. About that time, there was a muffled explosion upstairs, and he said, somebody came to him and said, he says, "The place is booby-trapped, so don't move around too much." So, move around too much? I didn't move at all. They gave me a German blanket and a box of K rations, and I spent the night in the corner. And the next day, they flew me back by a Cub observation plane to my base. Let me take my parachute with me, which was quickly cut up for scarves.
Fundamentally, we were to escort B-17 B-24s, and that was our primary job. But then on the way back, after we had a penetration, had enough fuel left, we'd go down the strafe, anything. You could strafe, even if somebody pushing a baby bug, it didn't make a damage. It's with the enemy. strafe railroad. Oh, I'll tell you, it's a lot of fun. You can destroy everything you want when you see it, and you're not accountable for anything. But we had, like I said, we had strafing missions. Then they have a strafe airports. Oh God, I think these German airfields had gun emplacements all over the place, and you strafe one of those once in a lifetime. I tell you, you've had enough, because the mortality rate was pretty high. You're getting hit. And I was fortunate. I did my 68 combat missions without any flak holes in me. That was a goddamn luck, I tell you.
Were you ever hit?
No, except on my second mission, when you flew a P-38, it had to fly below the fellow you were flying on as far as formation. And this guy he'd go down strafing. I'm just locked into him because your second mission, you don't know if you're up or down. You just follow whatever they told you to follow. And I flew so goddamn low, I flew through a bunch of pine trees. I still have the pine needles from my right engine. That thing caught on fire, and right here I'm east of Brussels. Oh, I said, did anybody see me? And so I feathered up an engine and came back, and I flew single engine back to the base. But God, he took me right over the town of Brussels. And he imagine flying single engine, trying to avoid anti-aircraft, going up and down like a yo-yo. Oh, Christ. I tell you, that'll make a Christian out of anybody.
Most of the crew were up in the cabin taking off because of the weight distribution of the aircraft. And I was sitting next to the bombardier, and I looked over and I said, Andy, I got a bad feeling about this. I think we're going to get it today. And he looked over at me and he said, Cookie, you son of a bitch, shut up, And unfortunately, I was correct. We flew a long mission. It was several hours to the target. I think the round trip mission that day would have been close to 11 hours. I mean, it was 5 or plus going up, and of course that many coming back. And we came past Graz. And then came up to getting up near the target. The target was Wiener Neustadt, a big German city, industrial city that had an enormous measurement factory and an adjoining airport to launch the planes and to service the factory. And our job was to bomb that. It had been bombed, I think, once or twice before. And as we were coming in on the city, about 12 or 15 miles from the target, we were attacked by a whole bunch of German fighters. I saw perhaps 6, and then I got busy because we'd been hit a couple of times. And then later, much later in the war, I got the S2 reports. And they said that 70 planes had been attacking our group, and it took out 9 of our group, and 4 men of my crew were killed. In the first pass, I had the luck to turn around to look. The bomb site's here. My navigation table is here. I'm looking up the side over the bomb aiming device, and all of a sudden there's a big noise and an explosion back up here. And I have a steel helmet on and a flak suit, and I feel the force of it. And I look down, and my navigation table is gone, just gone. You're just smoking elements around, And I took some pieces along the side where the flak suit stops on my back, and fortunately I had my helmet on. It protected everything up here. But I knew that bad things were happening, and that's probably the same round of that took out the co-pilot, because the co-pilot died from wounds in the air. He went down with the plane, and that's probably the thing that got him. And then, of course, the pilot sitting on the left seat, which would have been up here, he took another round. So that these aircraft they're shooting 20 millimeters. They can shoot them every 3 or 4 seconds. And our hydraulic system was out. We were out of formation. We had taken a lot of damage, more damage than I ever thought of. And I said to the pilot, I said, Chris, let's get the hell out of this son of a bitch. And he said, no, we're gonna try to bomb or something. He'd made some kind of a comment that after the war, he said, Cookie, he said, I wished we'd gotten out when you said, because more of us might have got out. So my fighting words as a big American hero was, let's get the hell out of this son of a bitch. A lot of noise, hydraulic fluid everywhere. The bailout button went off, and I was crawling back to bail out in the bomb bay doors, and then I heard I still had my earphones on, and somebody, I think the bombardier or somebody up in the deck said, Cookie, drop the bombs, the hydraulics are out. And the reason they were going to do that, because you couldn't open the bomb bay doors, you couldn't get out. So halfway down the hatch, I'm either turning around or backing up, and the poor nose gunner is trying to get out to bail out. He doesn't understand that I have to get back to the bomb site to toggle the switch. And finally, he thinks I've lost my mind, and I'm mad because I know I've got to get to that switch, or there's going to be some bad news for these guys. So I finally, I think I lay down, and he stumbles out over me, and then I managed to get to the bomb site. I toggle the bombs, and then I feel the plane kind of lift up, and I know the bomb bay doors are gone. And so then I turn around and go out, and then I'm standing. I come out of the bomb bay doors. I kind of lift myself up, and I'm looking at the co-pilot, and he's looking. I yell at him, or he looks around, and I say, "Come on," and he said, "Go on," to me, and now I know he was badly wounded when he went like that, and then the plane did something, and I fell out. I didn't bail out, I fell out. I just fell backwards out. And it goes from all this noise and smoke and confusion, and all of a sudden you're floating through the air, and it's quiet. You can hear, sound gets less and less. And I must have fallen, 5,000-6,000 feet. Then I pulled the ripcord, and I was just utterly shocked on how that hurts when you do that, because you're traveling at 120 miles an hour, and then all of a sudden you brake in maybe 50 feet or so to drift, and I remember I yelled, I screamed, I think, when it opened. It forced all the air out of me. Maybe that's why I have my present lung problem. But then I hit the ground, and I saw people looking for me. I was wounded. I took my flak suit off and wrapped my parachute out and hid it somewhat, although I don't think I dug a hole. I just put it under a brush and took off. And that night I could see guys with flashlights looking for me, and German voices all over the place. And I got up later that night and walked down this road, and it was dark, no moon. And I was walking in a place for a small road, and around the bend came 2 or 3 people, and I had nowhere to go. And the only thing I could do was be nonchalant, and I walked past them. And I really think that I was whistling and they passed and nothing happened. I didn't hear any yelling or anything, so I guess they didn't maybe they did and they didn't want to screw around with it because they thought I might be armed, you know. But then I darted off the road and took off overland and slept. I had my flight pants on and my jacket, so I was reasonably comfortable sleeping out. But then on the last day when I was running out of water trying to go up, you know, I got to snow and I was eating snow, and that's a bad thing to do when you're thirsty because you use more calories eating snow than you're losing ground as well as being dehydrated. And I looked at a cow once, and I considered killing it and eating it, but I was told later that that wouldn't have been a good thing because if you eat fresh meat that's got all the blood in it, that you're going to get sick. So I couldn't bring myself to kill the cow anyhow. Went down to this little house. I made the mistake that I would never make now. I knew where Yugoslavia was, but there was a big mountain between me and Yugoslavia. But I went up one side of the mountain and down the other instead of following the watershed, you know, or the contour. So that is why I probably exhausted myself. But at the end of the fifth day, I'd had it. I was wandered down. I saw this little shack and farm shack, and went in the front door, and we went to the front door and knocked on the door, and in my high school German, I said, "Ich bin hungrig," and I can't remember. It was a man, I think, and he went like that or something like that, and came out, and brought me a plate of milk, or some milk and some bread. And I sat down and I was eating it, but they had already notified, I think they sent their son out the other door and picked up what they call the Landwacht, the land watchers. And all of a sudden, a few minutes later, I saw these guys. I like to think they were in leather shorts, lederhosen. They may not have been. But they were walking out. I do remember they had two of the biggest rifles I'd ever seen in my life. And I said to myself, "Cook, you're not going to be a hero." And I took my .45 out, and I threw it as far as I could throw it. Because the Germans did not like American .45s, because the partisans were good at sneaking up behind German sentries in Yugoslavia and just blowing their heads off. I mean, that gun was, you know, just it'll take your head off at short range. So that's the capture. While I was waiting for my interrogation, they marched groups of people one way past my door. I was in a small room, about 5 feet by 4 feet, 6 foot ceiling, and no windows. And I'd hear machine gun fire. And then nothing. And then they'd turn the light on. Well, I think I peed in a pan or something. And they gave me a little bit of food once a day. And it was very warm. God, it was too warm in there. And then, you know, every 2 or 3 times a day or night, there would be this clump of people walking by, and then machine gun fire. And I said, "They're going to shoot me," you know. And I said, if they try to do that, I'm not gonna break. I said, I'm an American soldier, and I'm going to die like a man, you know. I really, you know, I was nutty enough to really feel that way, but I thought they were going to kill me. And then when they interrogate you, you know, you can be a little looser. But then after that, they gave us a supply of Red Cross GI clothing. I had some enlisted men clothing, big great coat, saved my ass when on the marching, and toothbrush, razor with one blade. And I remember I shined the blade up in a cup, to shave, and I had that one blade for all that time in the camp. And put us on a railway train, third-class compartments. Got to the camp on June 6th, and as I was walking into it, I went past the memorial that the British flyers had constructed on the 50 guys that the Germans shot after the big escape there. And I went into the camp and was processed, and while we were in there, the Germans had a loudspeaker system. And in German, I heard the words, Heute der große Kampf in den Westen hat begonnen. And there was a guy next to me. I said, what in the hell are they talking about? He said, the second front has started. He said, we've invaded. It was Heute, today, the great battle in the West has begun. Well, that was the invasion day. So they told us, over their loudspeaker system in German. And I kind of said, hell, we'll be out of here in 6 weeks. And then nearly a year later, I'm still there,
Maybe I could just kind of describe one patrol as being more or less generic. If I understand it correctly, the reserve battalion had to provide a company strength patrol every day, reconnaissance patrol usually. This one was a combat patrol, and that's the only one I was ever on, as a company strength patrol. Later we went with a battalion strength patrol, but evidently they had gotten word that there were some Japanese on our side of the Matanikaw River. And so I think it was L Company they sent to chase them back across the river where they belonged. And I got to go as the radio operator. Incidentally, that was the only way you could get enough to eat. The company that had the patrol that day drew double rations. And the radio operators that went with the company got to eat with the company. So we were prone to volunteering with a fair degree of regularity. The everyday rations were pretty slim and pretty poor because a good part of our food supply went away with the ships when they left. And so we were eating captured Jap oats that they used to feed their horses and captured Jap rice. I managed to find somewhere, I don't remember where it was, a can of Jap pork and beans packed with seaweed. And I guess I'm not very generous or kind of an animal-like type. I hid my can of pork and beans and sneaked off into a gully and ate it all. But the food generally was pretty terrible. The cooks, maybe they could have done worse with what they had to work with, I don't know. But if you can visualize taking 5-pound tins of corned beef and gallon cans of peas and dumping them together in a GI can and stirring it up until everything is unidentifiable and getting it halfway lukewarm and serving that as chow, that was chow. But anyhow, I was with the company and we were walking up the trail along the coast. It's mostly maybe 50, 60 feet from the water. And we were going along, and I guess we were maybe halfway to the Matanikaw. And the fellow that was on point came running back to the lieutenant, and he had a little fish in his hand, and it was still wiggling. He'd picked it up out of the trail. And so that kind of gave us the idea that there's somebody up ahead of us. And we went on, and we got, just short of the river, and the lieutenant said, "This will be the CP," so we set our radio up. Great, huge banyan tree. And we set it up on the ocean side of the banyan tree. I guess I remember that location because that's the place I got the most frightened, the most disturbed of any time I was there. I had the radio watch, and we were dug in a hole under a big tree, and in that big tree there was a huge branch about 16, 18 inches in diameter that had broken off and was hooked over another branch, and it turned out to be right directly over our radio. And we had an air raid, which we had every day, and they were bombing along the runway, and my real concern was whether those bombs were going to last till they got to us or not. And I really wasn't worried about the bomb, but I was just sure the bomb was going to jar that big branch loose and it was going to fall on my head. And by the time it was over, they ran out of bombs, fortunately, quarter of a mile from us. But by the time it was over, I was just shaking so bad that one of the guys gave me a cigarette, and it really calmed my nerves down, and I've been smoking the damn things ever since. So someday I'm going to sue the Marine Corps for starting me smoking. A few minutes later, it was just a god-awful firefight broke out. Apparently they had walked right into the middle of a Jap bivouac before they realized it. And so this firefight went on for, I guess, half an hour or so, and pretty soon we see these guys running back down the trail. There'd be a couple, and then one, and then a few more. And so we're wondering what is going on, and we're waiting for somebody to come and tell us to pack up and move out. And pretty soon the first sergeant came backing down the trail with his Tommy gun at the ready, and we asked him what's going on, and he turned around and jumped like we'd shot. And what the hell are you bastards doing here? Don't you know I'm the only one left between you and them? And so we debated for 2 seconds over whether to put a grenade in the radio and blow it up or pack it up and take it. And we decided we'd probably get court-martialed if we blew it up, so we packed it up and took it. But it didn't take long to pack.
Colonel Shapley kept calling me and saying there's a big cave up on Mount Elephant. And he said there's a gun coming out of that cave that's picking off our landing barges coming in. You got to get it, Phil. We had at that time the M4A2s tanks, which were a medium tank with a 75 millimeter. And I couldn't see this cave because the cave, Mount Elephant, is a red clay, and they had plastered the door of the cave with that red clay. And they would open it, and they would wheel this gun out and fire about 3 rounds and go back in. So he was really appealing to me to get that gun. So I foolishly jumped out of my tank and to try to talk to somebody, see if he could find out where that gun was. Just about that time, about 30 Japs came up over a little mound right in front of me, and I was out of my tank with a 45 revolver. Well, there was no problem because the tanks just mowed them down in a hurry. And then one of those freaks in war, up comes a guy from another regiment. Is in landings, they always get mixed up. And he was a kid that sat across from me in a U.S. history class back in Virginia high school. And I said, Les, and he says, Phil, and I said, where's that gun? He says, I'll tell you exactly where. So he told me where the gun was, and I fired a Willie Peter, that's a white phosphorus. And he says, just above that, about 10 meters. So I got on the radio, told all of the tanks to zero in up on that spot, just above where that Willie Peter had hit. and listen for my load up with it. If you had an HE in, leave it in. Otherwise, put in an AP armor-piercing shell, anti-tank shell, and they all did. I had 18 tanks. So sure enough, that door opens up and whambo. We set all these rounds off. This is a little grim, but there were legs and boots flying, and helmets with heads in them flying, and we knocked out the Jap crew plus the gun, and the gun didn't go back in, nor did the door close. So we fired about another a couple of rounds into it, and then we went ahead and attacked, and we made more ground that day than they expected us to. Very successful day. But we had gone so far that we had overextended our lines, and there were gaps. So it ended up that headquarters, my three tanks in my headquarters, plus one platoon stayed, I guess, in about 1,000 yards from the beach, just beyond the regimental CP. Another platoon went up and was at a junction of a road called Harmon Road, up towards Mount Alafan. The third platoon went down south on the right along the beach. That night, all three positions were hit, and the most exciting one was up at Harmon Road. They could hear tank noises, and the infantry came running down and said, "We need tanks. We hear tanks coming." Well, one of the rules we had was you never move a tank at night. But they're relatively blind. You just have that little periscope. But Jim Williams was my lieutenant up there. He moved the tanks and got them into position, and the gunner was firing a machine gun with tracers. When he saw the tracers going straight up, he let it have a round of HE. And this sounds like a big deal. It isn't, because their tanks were nothing. It blew the entire front of the tank off, set it on fire, and that lit up 4 more tanks coming behind it. And he methodically got 3 more of the tanks. The 5th tank turned and went back into the darkness of the night. And at daylight in the morning, he got that tank out ahead about 2,240 yards. I paced it off, so I know it was that far. All right, that's the first platoon. Then the second platoon, the Japs had come down, and there was a little mound of green grass, looked really great, was ahead of us, maybe 50 to 100 yards. And we didn't give it pay it any attention. But during the night, down came about 40 to 50 Japs, and we finally figured out why they came down. This mound was a pile of ammunition with sod over it, and they were coming down to get that ammunition. Well, in their little firefight, they set one tank on fire, but these were diesel tanks, and we put the tank out just by whipping it with our field jackets, and the tank fought the next day. But I was in the foxhole alongside my tank, and out of the darkness, we still hadn't really established where the Japs were or what they were doing there. And this figure comes up towards me on my tank, and I didn't make it out as a Jap initially. And I pulled my pistol out and had it right on him. He was maybe 5 feet from me, and he turned and put his magnetic mine, which has got 4 magnets, on my tank. And I knew then what it was, and he turned and ran, and I shot and killed him. But the mine went off. As I ducked down in my hole, I had a canteen cup over here filled with cold coffee, and a piece of shrapnel went into that, and it sizzled the coffee and warmed it up for me. And anyhow, in the morning, we had one of our guys, we had telephones on our back of our tanks. He got on the telephone and guided one of the tanks up into this little mound area, and we killed, I think it was 50-some Japs there. And down to the right, south, the 3rd platoon stopped a group of Japs coming up the beach. And Colonel Shapley called and says, congratulated me and our tankers and said, okay, you guys saved the beachhead. He said, we never could have stopped him without the tanks.
Corpsman we carried our assault pack, which is a double pack, with a bedroll over the top of it. We had 2 medical pouches. We had our own individual medical pouch. We had ammunition pouches. We had a gas mask. We had a machete and our rifle. And when we made an assault landing, we also had to carry an additional packet of medical supplies strapped to the front of us. Some of these weighed from anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds. The one I had was folded canvas blankets. It was heavy. I don't know how much it weighed, but it could have been close to the upper figure. Then we came down the debarkation nets and transferred into Higgins boats. And then when we got to the coral reefs, we had to transfer to Amtracs. Here we lost a lot of men because we had so much weight on us. By the time we jumped, we had to wait till the Higgins boats and the Amtracs were level with each other in the surf and then jump. And some of them didn't make it. And those that fell in that were able to keep afloat at all were ground up between the 2 vessels. We just wanted to get in and out of there, actually. As if I can remember as much about it, it was just that I wanted to get on the beach and get somewhere.
How did the beach look?
Beach was pretty bad, strewn with bodies, torn up vehicles, and vegetation all broken and torn up, and you could see the ridges that were being bombarded by the aircraft over there, and smoke. I mean, you know, just hell.
All through training exercises, the 4th Platoon had been the fire base for any attack operations. And so on D+1, when we shoved off, it was all planned. We had done this, we had taken Iwo Jima so many times in training. It was almost by rote we could do it. The aerial bombardment was supposed to be at 0700, and the artillery then would commence at 0715, and the tanks would jump off at 0730, and the infantry at 0732. None of this happened. The aerial was late, the artillery was even later. We jumped off, and we never did see the infantry. And we were the lead platoon. All through practice we're the fire base, and now we're the lead platoon. Some of us from the West Coast had seen Japanese civilians, of course. Most people from the South and Midwest had never seen a Japanese. Only our platoon sergeant, Bill Unger, had ever seen a Japanese soldier. Fortunately, he was the tank commander of my tank that morning. And we knew we were at the front when he suddenly said, "I don't see anybody." So we knew we were there. And then one of our tanks got hit with everything under the sun from an ambush, anti-tank ambush. And I don't think it was knocked out, though. And all we did after that, we were not like Patton in Europe. We were like mobile pillboxes. And I remember trying to take airfield number 1, and where the Japanese had changed their anti-tank guns, their anti-aircraft guns to fire horizontally, and they made excellent anti-tank weapons. And I guess that was about that time, about the D+5, when they committed the 3rd Tank Battalion. And the rumor was that all the tanks were going to go up there that day, hub to hub, and we were going to take that airfield. Or we're going to go back to the beach dig the tanks in, and wait for the rest of the Corps to come up from Saipan, but we're not getting off the island. That was the rumor. But fortunately, we broke their back that day. It took number one. And after that, every day seemed like the same. We had one bulldozer tank in each platoon, I think it was, or in each company. And the idea was to protect that bulldozer to keep the Japanese from blowing that blade off, because there were no roads. And once the bulldozer blade was off, the game was over until we could get that blade welded back on. And in the meantime, the Japanese would hit us with mortars, and we'd try to find the mortar positions and fire back at them. And you sit there on a road, you had no way to go sideways, and you try to outguess them as, oh, all right, move forward 50. That one came right down our tail, move forward 50. And the next one would be 10 yards in front of you. All right, move back 10. And just try to outguess whoever the mortarman was until they knocked him out. The infantry had knocked him out. But we were nothing more than mobile pillboxes. We had one flamethrower tank per platoon. And I don't remember that we ever used, the bow gunner ever used his flamethrower, but we used that flamethrower tank. And of course, the infantry had their flamethrowers. And I've always been of the opinion that if it hadn't been for the flamethrower, we'd still be fighting the Japanese in the islands. It was the only thing to get those people out with. I guess it was about D+4. Drizzly morning. We couldn't see because the rain kept coming down the periscopes. And so we turned off our engines and opened the hatches a little bit, hoping we could hear this rumored Japanese counterattack with tanks. But it never materialized. And then somebody alerted us to the fact that we should turn around and look at Suribachi. And there was that flag flying. And it was a great sight. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. About 10 o'clock in the morning, that first flag went up. One other morning, we were just sitting there avoiding mortar fire, moving forward, moving back, moving forward, moving back. And Unger and I were chess players. And we had that little miniature chess set on the breech block of 75. We're playing chess. And looked over, and in a shell hole, or sort of a pit, there were a bunch of Marines lobbing grenades one way, and the Japanese lobbing grenades back at them, and one guy sitting over in a corner reading a letter. You know, the thing about it, you can't remember pain, because if you could, you'd be in the booby hatch, and no woman would ever have a second baby. But you do remember the humorous things. You do remember the humorous things. Now, that first morning when this tank in our platoon, or our company got hit, our platoon got hit, the driver was a good friend of mine, Robert Von Meggy, who lives in Los Angeles. And Von was the driver. And to my memory, now this may be an embellishment, I don't know, but it's a good story. We had the throat mics for intercommunication, and Von thought that we were on intercom, and actually we were outgoing. And so his message was heard all over the island and beyond. It was, "Lay off, you bastards, I'm a lover, not a fighter." As I recall, around, I think it was the 10th of March, and we were going to do the same thing. We had withdrawn the afternoon before because the infantry felt they couldn't hold the ground. So we withdrew for the night, and they got back to a position they could hold. And mind you, in these days, we were gaining 50, 100 yards a day. That's all we were making, 50, 100 yards a day. And we went up the next morning, and as I say, I was loading, and Schwartzel was the gunner, and Unger was the platoon sergeant and tank commander. And I think he told Tilseth, the driver, to stay in our same tracks. We were able to pick those up. And because we hadn't hit a mine the day before. He had no sooner said that than boom. I never heard it. I woke up, I was laying on the turret floor, bleeding like a stuck pig. And the tank I remember it was filled with dust. I heard some moaning down in front. It was Burris, the assistant driver. The other three guys had already left, not a scratch on them. And I think I put a thermite grenade in the breech block, but I don't know whether I did or not. But Burris was able to crawl over the transmission, and the two of us exited the driver's hatch. And by that time, Captain Sands' tank had moved up close to us. And we went over the front slope plate, hit the deck, and underneath Captain's tank, and I think there were bullets bouncing off the bogey wheels, but I'm not sure. But we got in through the escape hatch in Captain Sands' tank. Time we get back to the battlefield station, Burris was incapable of moving. Both his legs had been shattered. And I remember they helped him out the tank commander's hatch and slid him down the barrel of the 75 onto a stretcher. I was walking wounded, so I was all right. But there was no question about evacuating Burris. I didn't want to get evacuated, and to this day, I don't know whether I refused evacuation because I didn't want to leave my friends, or I was afraid of being put in an infantry replacement outfit. At any rate, they sent me to the field hospital, and a few hours later, some corpsman sewed my cheek up. He put 3 stitches in it, in this wound. And I asked him, no anesthesia, no nothing. And I asked him, I said, what the hell did you do before the war, sew sacks? And he said, yes. And he was from my hometown in California. I didn't know him. Now, my real story about this wound, this scar, is that, and I know this is an embellishment, there were 8 of them that came at me, and I only had 7 shots in my .45. The 8th guy slapped me right across the face with his sword. I have the sword.
Every day at dawn, we would get up and attack. I would hear from the captain that at dawn we're going to get up and we're going to attack. First there'd be an artillery barrage, and then we're going to go forward and just wipe these guys up. Well, the artillery barrage would come, and then we would get up out of our holes and go a few yards, and there'd be machine gun fire at us. We'd have to hit the deck and eventually go back to our holes because there was no way we could move. We were just pinned down. In fact, that next morning was about the worst time I ever had on Iwo, because the very next morning we were out for this attack, and we get pinned down, and we have a bunch of guys hit, and the corpsman would come up to take them out. The corpsman would get hit. And I remember we were just getting murderous fire from this line of hillocks just in front of us, murderous fire from machine guns from the Japanese. We were pinned down in our holes, we couldn't move. And remember, a corpsman came up to pull in one of the wounded, and the corpsman went to get him, and as he went to get him, he got shot through the arm, and his arm was just flopping around, like that. And he was knocked down, but of course he got up and ran. He got over to our holes, he got hit again, and we reached up and pulled him into our foxhole. And he had a great big hole in his arm. We put, at that time, we were supposed to put sulfa in and then put on the dressing, I'd never given a shot of morphine, but he told us to open his kit, and get out some morphine and give it to him. So I did, And what saved us was fog. Fog came in and I didn't mention that this area we were on was very hot. It's like Iwo's a volcanic island, And it was so hot that you could dig down only about a foot. Once you got down a foot, it was so hot you couldn't stand it. So you could dig a foxhole only about a foot. Fortunately, there were other holes there that the Japanese had made, and there were shell holes we could use for foxholes, and dig a foxhole in the bottom of that, So we were enough underground, it was be safe. But by evening, after a full day, it was cooled off enough you could dig down about another 6 inches. The good part of it was if you wanted to cook anything, like a sea ration, all you had to do was punch a hole in the can so it wouldn't explode, and put it in this hot soil and it would cook. It was great. But anyway, the steam and the fog shielded things so we could get the wounded people out. but we were losing people. We lost about 5 or 6 people then, right that time, you know, just that one supposed attack. We were stuck like that the next 4 or 5 days, you know. They would bring up tanks, and the tanks would spray the whole area with, we would send another one of our guys who was experienced, you know, a guy who had been in the Raiders. He was a corporal named Anthony. He would go get aboard the tanks and try to point out to the tankers just where he spotted the things were firing at us, but they couldn't see them. And of course, the Japanese would just go underground, and when the tanks were there, they have flat trajectory and they can't fire mortars. So unless you get a direct hit on the thing, you can't wipe it out. The Japanese would come right up as soon as the tanks had left and fire at us again. So we were stuck there for about 4 or 5 days, you know. Everything had just sort of ground to a halt. And then the 5th day, which was March 7th, I guess the 4th day, March 7th, I got word during the night that Colonel Pollock, who had the platoon on our right, who replaced the one that had been pulled out, you know, replaced, he was going to make a dawn attack by surprise and with no artillery bombardment, hope to catch the Japanese off guard. So we should jump off just before dawn, you know, just at first light, and move forward, and without a barrage, prepare time, and we would catch them. So we passed the word. We had to pass the word from foxhole to foxhole, and sure enough, at dawn we get up and we move out of our holes, you know, into this rough country just ahead of us, where all this heavy fire had been coming from. I'm moving with the guys, and we get the very first line of hills, and one of the what happened was that one of our guys spotted a Japanese who was supposed to be a sentry, was sitting there asleep, you know, with his just sitting there like this with his head in his lap. He was supposed to be watched. The other guys were all underground. Well, he shot this guy, and of course that set off the alarm for the Japanese. So they all come running up out of their cave, you know, out of this big cave they were in. We figured out there were 2 embrasures. We figured this out pretty quick because there were Japanese coming out of both ends of the cave, and we were right amongst them. The remnants of the platoon were there, you know. And I was at the front end of I went back and forth between my 2 units, you know. We had 2 units ready fighting. We couldn't see each other, but we're very close together. And I remember Sisk, the big fella from Indiana, was in charge of one, and he was up hard by the cave, you know. By that time, they had killed a lot of Japanese just outside the cave. They shot them and killed them with grenades. He was right up near the cave's opening, and he was throwing grenades into the cave, and one time a great big piece of what I know now was liver came out and just landed at my feet. And Sis said, we're really getting at it. We're really getting him now. It was a piece of Japanese liver. And then the flamethrower came up, and the flamethrower squirted the cave, and they all ran out the back end of it, you know. There was the other end of the cave, and I'd been there just a moment or 2 earlier. And there were just about 6 of us that were up at the other side of the cave, you know, up at the end of a draw, you know, just a gully. And we suddenly got a lot of fire from our left, you know, from the gully. And my men all went up to the edge of the gully, and grenades began to come at us, you know. They would hit the ground, and then they'd roll down into the gully and explode. And our guys were throwing grenades down the other way at the Japanese, who were firing up at them from below and throwing the grenades back. We were pulling the pin, and we'd hold it for a couple of seconds, then roll it down or throw it, you know, so it would explode, not giving them time to throw it back. But they were shooting at us, too. We were just getting a hell of a fire. And I remember Nick put his helmet up, and it came back with a big hole in it. And Frost, my other squad leader, he'd been a barman, and the Browning automatic rifle, he had a Browning automatic rifle that weighed about 20 pounds and gave semi-automatic fire. And he was up there as long as he could, you know. And I remember he backed off with this from this heavy fire, holding this bar. he said, Christ almighty, he said, there's hundreds of them in there. Why can't they send a whole company instead of just a couple of squads? I said, it's all we got, Frost, you know. Anyway, the captain, I was on the radio with him. I was telling him what was going on, and he says, can you use a half-track? Half-track's a track vehicle that has a 75 millimeter. Yes, send it up. So he sent it up, and boy, it steamed right up to the edge, you know, and it just is armored, and it was able to fire right down, point-blank fire at the Japanese, and we were really getting him. It took this couldn't have taken more than about 5 minutes total, you know, this firefight. But we got back on top. Once the half-track got there, we were able to come up, and our grenades were really getting him. The other thing that Sisk was doing, he was throwing grenades over the ridge, you know, so they would hit the Japanese as they came out of the cave and back. There must have been, I think, about 50 or 60 Japanese that were killed outside the cave, and I don't know how many of them died in the cave because we never got inside. You know, I didn't get inside. Some of the guys did go inside and came out with a couple of swords and things, but I didn't go in the cave. I just had other things to do. But things got pretty quiet about that time. We'd had some casualties, and we had to evacuate the casualties. And it looked like we were on top of things, you know. The Japanese, all the Japanese we knew about were dead, and the cave was silenced, and we thought we were in pretty good shape, you know. We'd lost half a dozen people, but most of them wounded, not killed. And I was standing there talking about 50 feet from the cave with a couple of the guys. Suddenly there's tremendous noise like nothing I've ever heard before or since, you know, just the most god-awful noise you can imagine. And I turn around and I see this hillside where the cave was, you know, just rising up in the air, just going straight up, you know, and I thought, my God, you know, rocks and boulders, big boulders. And so then it starts to fall, you know, it goes out like a mushroom cloud and begins to fall. And so I hit the deck. There's nothing else to do. There's no place to hide. I just hit the deck, you know, and all this stuff began to land on my back, you know. And I thought, my God, I'm being buried here. So some of it hurt, you know. But I was lucky, again, because if I'd been a few feet farther out, the biggest rocks would have hit me. That explosion killed quite a few people. Were killed by the size of the biggest rocks, you know. We had to dig them out. But the people were in closer, not too close to be blown up, but close enough, they got a lighter kind of rubble, you know. The big rocks had gone over my head. So I was only half buried, and when it all stopped, I could sort of force myself up, you know, and out. Remember, our radio had an aerial that was bent, you know, but it still worked. And I told the captain, I said, we've got to have stretcher bearers up here. We've got a bunch of people that need help right now. So the captain came forward with the whole headquarters company, you know. They all came up with stretchers, and they dug the people out and took them back, you know, the ones that were still alive. And meantime, I'd taken the people that the captain had told me. He said, be sure you make sure that the line is plugged, because sometimes when they do that, there's a counterattack. So I took what guys could still walk, you know, and we went up and made a line to the, in case any Japanese came through it, but none of them did. There was nobody left. They had to counterattack at that time. Anyway, I was kind of shook, you know. Everybody was kind of shook. But, and I didn't mention that during this firefight, I had a hell of a time keeping in touch with the captain by radio, you know. I was just involved in the firefight, you know, trying to shoot and to make sure that, go back and forth, make sure I knew what was going on. And the idea of, you know, working this switch and talking to him was just difficult. He kept chewing me out, you know. You gotta keep on, tell me what's happening, you know. Don't forget to press the switch. So I tried to tell him, but anyway. We got things together after a while, and then we decided we would go forward and attack, you know, because we thought it was a good time to attack. We had a few people left, and what was left of the platoon next to us from the other battalion, they had lost heavily too, and they lost their platoon leader, so they were combined with my outfit into one outfit, you know. We would go forward the attack. So we we go through this rough country for about 400 or 500 yards. Every so often we stop by an occasional rifleman who would hit us, one time by a machine gun, but you know, there were not many of them, and it was open enough country that we could take them out, you know, one by one. And we made about 500 yards, the only gain we made during my whole time there. But it was really good, pretty good gain. And that brought us into some really rough country where we could see the ocean just beyond us, but we could see that it was dropped off. By this time, it's nearly dark. So I told the captain what it was like, and he said, well, you better find a place to dig in. So we decided to dig in just inside this area, you know, where we began to get some fire from up ahead. So we dug in because it was pretty close to dark. We wanted to dig in before dark. And we began to get some pretty heavy fire about that time from the area ahead. And I lost two people that I really cared about a lot. One was Anthony, the old raider. I say old, he must have been 30, but he seemed old as hell to me. He was badly shot in the hip. I'd sent him out to make sure that there were no caves or snipers left behind the area we had just overrun. And he got shot by somebody doing that. His hip was laid open, and I never saw him again till he was taken out. And I never found out what happened to him. He came from Oklahoma. And then Sith, the guy that had done so well at the cave, was putting out wire just before dark, you know, and I heard a shot and then this terrible groan, you know, just an awful groan. I could see him crawling, and he had gut shot with a rifle bullet, you know. We got him evacuated, and some of the guys saw him in the hospital afterward, but I never did. He died about 2 months afterward of peritonitis in the hospital at Pearl. So sad, you know. But anyway, he was such a good Marine, you know. He was always out in front, always doing what had to be done, out putting up wire. He knew he could have been shot, but he just did it, you know. Somebody had to do it, and he wouldn't ask anybody else to do it. He did it himself. They were the best troops anybody could ever want to serve with.
Colonel Damke didn't think I did enough work. So then he called me in, he says, Fisk, what in the hell do you do? So I told him, I said, well, I get the buglers up and sound a couple of calls today. And he says, then what are you doing? I didn't dare tell him I went to the Red Cross shack to have donuts and coffee, see. So I said, well, I get everything together. He said, what's everything? Well, he was a stickler for detail. I said, well, I'd go and make sure the buglers know exactly what they're going to do and who's going to do what. He said, I don't think you're doing your job. I said, sir, I am. I'm the regimental sergeant bugler. He says, I know that. He says, but you don't do much. So he said, I tell you what. He says, we're short on assistant platoon leaders. And I said, oh boy, I knew what that's going to entail. So he says, now you're going to be the assistant platoon leader for your outfit with the 13th Marines. I was about ready to open my mouth, and he says, you're dismissed. That started me on the road to Iwo. That was up at the Big Island. And then we trained, and then we didn't get our briefing. We went aboard ship in January. So we had about almost 30 days at sea, getting all the flotilla and all the ships together, the task force and all that. And we anchored at Saipan and Tinian. And then that was about 2 weeks before the actual landing on Iwo Jima. Then they gave us a briefing, and we saw this relief map of this little tiny island. We said, oh my gosh, we can take that in a week, no problem. So this lieutenant says, well, he says, you guys got a piece of cake. He said, within about 5 to 7 days, he said, we should be home. Yes, sir. We took his word for it. He lied. It took us 4 days to take Mount Suribachi. We haven't even touched the rest of the island. 4 days just to take Mount Suribachi, at the cost of about almost 1,000 Marines. Then we started on the other half of the island. That was 34 days of constant fighting, almost 24 hours a day. If there was a hell, we went through it on Iwo Jima. It took us 34 days to capture the island, and the 5th Marine Division, we had 5,892 dead, over 17,000 wounded. The Japanese had approximately 25,000 on the island, and at the end of 33 days, or 34 days, we only took 337 prisoners. I have never in my life been through anything like that. It was over 2.5 weeks before we could even begin to bury our dead. We just didn't have the time. And you fought day and night. You'd go to another guy's foxhole and try to wake him up, and he just looked at you through eyes that cannot see. Up on Hill 362, the meat grinder, we lost over 200 Marines to try to take that in about 3 hours. The carnage, the death was you'd have to be there to see it. I have never in my life have seen so many dead Marines and dead Japanese. And you look at those, and you look at your own, and you just think, my God, what have we done? Why is this possible? Why do we have to do it? It's not because we wanted. We were ordered to do it. Finally, when we left the island, there was just 6 from my outfit, and we were on the fantail as just glad to get the hell out of there. We secured the island, we turned it over to the Army for occupation. And I remember Green and a couple of the other guys were on a fantail. We were looking at the island, and none of us said much. But as we were slowly leaving the island and Green looked at me and he says, Sarge, was it worth it? I said, I don't know. I said, we lost a lot of our friends. He said, yeah. And until it disappeared, the island, none of us said anything more. And all the way going back to Hilo, everybody was so quiet with their own thoughts and wondered, my God, what did we go through? And we're still here. I'll never forget that.
We went along on the march for a while, not really knowing what to expect. We had all seen the Japanese up close, and we knew what the uniforms looked like. We knew everything about them. But I remember at one point looking at one of these Jap soldiers, and he looked just like a picture I'd had in the history book of Attila the Hun. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good description. But we went on our way, and I developed a fine skill of being unnoticed. I found that anybody who attracted attention would almost invariably get the wrong kind of attention. About halfway along, when people would come alongside of the road and they would give us V for victory, and if they could, they'd pass to us little packets of rice wrapped in banana leaves. At this point, a little girl, she was about adolescent or thereabouts, and she ran up to the line and gave a soldier a packet of rice, and there was a Japanese soldier coming right up to her, and he didn't like what had happened. He knocked that packet of rice to the ground, took his rifle butt and smashed her right in the center of the face. And you could hear the bones of her head crushing. They were just like somebody had stuck a hatchet into a melon, just crushed her. And she dropped to the ground like a rag doll. And the other Japanese soldiers were unhappy about that, but they couldn't do anything. We couldn't do anything. And the little girl was just dropped like a rag doll. Later, about half an hour later, we were going along a little farther, and a Filipino signaled to some of us. There was a man from the 19th Bomb was near me, and the Filipino ran up to give him the packet of rice, handed to him, and a rifle shot rang out, and the Filipino dropped. And apparently it was the same guy that had hit the little girl, had fired the shot. And the packet of rice dropped no more than 2 or 3 feet away from the guy in the 19th Bomb. And he hesitated for just a second. I told him, I said, don't do it. It isn't worth it. And he thought it over. He was hungry, and he was going to go for it. So he did, and that rifle shot again, and he dropped right over the packet of rice. That was about the way it went.
They marched us back to some place, I don't know the name of it, where we sat down for a while and then eventually marched on farther to a rail spur. And then we were put in 40 and 8s, and they are designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses. They're much smaller than American boxcars, as you probably know. They crammed about 70 or 75 of us in there. You couldn't all sit down or stand at the same time. We had about half of us would try to walk in a circle, and the other half would sit. Then we'd change positions. Well, Christmas Day, I think we were in the boxcar somewhere between 7 and 8 days. But anyhow, Christmas Day was the 5th day. I do recall that, because the Germans were singing Christmas carols outside. And I found out later it took us almost 9 days to move 200 miles. That's how bad our planes had the tracks shot up. So eventually, we got no food while we were in there. They put in 2 buckets of water a day. And we did not get out at all for latrine purposes. Fortunately, it was cold, and all the excrement froze. If it had been summertime, it would have been terrible. but a couple of guys died in there. And the only thing we could do with them was stack them one on top of the other and use them for a seat. But we headed on up to Hammelburg. They put us in the Stalag at Hammelburg. That's the same one that Patton's son-in-law was in. And you recall perhaps he launched a big raid to try to save him and lost his whole column in there. But anyhow, I was at Hammelburg for, several weeks, I guess. And we got no breakfast in Hammelburg. We were in stables, quartered in stables, stone stables, and it was cold, around zero. And you had one little tiny coal-fired heater in there. And if you were more than 3 feet from there, you were cold. We slept on a board, we had one blanket, and we got no breakfast. We got a dipper of tea at noon, and we got 2 little new potatoes about the size of small eggs for dinner. Well, I soon found there was a method to that. After feeding us that type of fare for about a week, they came in and said, now, if you will volunteer to go out and work, you'll get better food. Well, I was a non-com, so I didn't have to volunteer. But I figured it couldn't be any worse than this, so I did volunteer. I had been holding church services in the Stalag there. They let me do that, and I kind of hated to give that up, but seemed like it was going to be a matter of survival. So I was put on a train, sent down the Main. The Main River is the one that runs through Frankfurt. It's Frankfurt on Main. Well, we were north of Frankfurt. There was a fairly good-sized town called Markheidenfeld. But then we were put into, the fellows that volunteered that they sent down there, there's 53 of us, we were sent to a little village called Hoffenlohr. And we were told we were going to work in a factory. Well, it was some factory. We were put into some barracks about a quarter mile from the factory out of this little village. All 53 of us, this barracks. But this factory that they put us in was a baby crib factory.
It would go in streaks. It would be they'd be halfway civilized to us, and other times they wouldn't be. Well, some of the guards they all had English in high school when they went to school, but they couldn't, you can't, just like if you studied Spanish in school, you couldn't go to Mexico and talk Spanish to them, and they couldn't do that. But they were all, some of the ones that were more humane would want to practice their English. One day he asked them if tables were turned. Now this is what he asked them, and this is what he was thinking. If tables were turned, and he was a prisoner, and they were the guards, would they come in and cut his throat at night? Now that's what the guard asked them. Well, they didn't have any idea what he talked about, and they wanted to agree with him about everything because he was good to them. So they said, oh yeah. Well, that whole detail turned into a hell detail. And that night, that they took, they started beating us if we didn't go fast with a pick handle, to make us go faster and everything like that. We couldn't figure out what was wrong. And that night, they took the guys from that mining car. There was 3 or 4 of them on each car. I can't remember for sure. And then the mining car above that, next to them, and the one on each side of them. So there was probably 7, 8, 9 people there. And the Japs guards lived on one side, and we lived on the other side. And they had a flagpole with the flaming there in the center. Well, they tied those guys to the flagpole there, and they got pick handles, and they beat those guys unmercifully for about about 4 o'clock till dark, till after dark, and they just beat them as hard as they could on the backs with those pick handles, and when they turned them loose and brought them back to camp, they couldn't hardly walk or anything. You know, they were all beat to pieces, and none of those guys ever worked again. And they sent them away to where they had an American hospital, a hospital for prisoners at Bilibid, an old Spanish prison, and they sent them there. But whether any of those guys survived or not, I don't know. I doubt it very much. But from then on, every time you'd slow down or something, boy, you'd get a pick handle across your back, and you'd get stood at attention and knocked down, and all kinds of things. Just mean, you know, just hated us from then on.
They sent me to a place called Stalag 17A. And that wasn't all that bad because the Germans at war were still going pretty good for them. So they treated us pretty good. And if you wanted to get out of camp, you could bribe your way out with 2 cigarettes. But you had to be careful once you got out. See if they caught you around any railroad track or anything like that after dark. They didn't ask no questions, they shot you. And if you got out of a prison camp in the middle of Germany and you never had any money, your chances of paying out were pretty slim. The only hope you had was you'd get captured by somebody who wasn't going to shoot you. And so anyway, the escapes and one thing another got to be so rampant that they moved us to a place called Stalag 17B. And I remember the first formation we had when we got there, they lined us all up, and Sergeant Turk was the German in charge of the camp. He had Colonel above him, but he was the guy that did what the Colonel said. He guided us all up, and we all had to stand there at attention. And he said, "Gentlemen, I must tell you this. Escaping will no longer be the sport. Anyone trying to escape will be shot." And we all threw our hats up in the air and cheered. And a couple of days later, somebody tried it. And he had a nice funeral. Escaping from Stalag 17B wasn't like Hogan's Heroes and the movie. It was damn serious business. You'd have to get shot.
When we all arrived in Shanghai, until day whatever it was to come home from Japan, we were inundated with lice in our clothes and fleas. And that was the darndest thing you can ever experience, is to have your clothing filled with lice and no way to get rid of them. At night before you go to bed, you'd try to take off your clothes and kill all the lice with your fingernails, but you could never get them all. And in the morning there'd be a new supply of them. And the fleas jumping all over all the time. But working in that shipyard, my brother and I were able to take our clothes off and put them in boiling water, and that kills lice and fleas very rapidly, instantly. So we had an advantage working there in that shipyard. However, the war was about to come to an end in 1945, and what we experienced there was mass bombings of Osaka by the American B-29s and P-51s. And our shipyard was destroyed, and so was part of our camp. Just before that was probably about 4 months before the war ended. And so they had to get us out of there. They marched us to a train, and we were taken up into northern Japan, where they had a stainless steel mill. And we were what you might call slave laborers again, just carrying things around from one place to the other in that stainless steel plant until the war ended. I would say in Osaka, during the daytime, we were always with civilians. The Japanese guards were surrounding the shipyard so that nobody's you would never try to escape there. You couldn't go anywhere. But the Japanese would march you there, and you didn't interface with them all day long. So the civilians were very. In fact, if it hadn't been for some of us, they helped us. They helped provide little bits of food, and they were starving themselves, but they felt compassionate. That didn't happen in Shanghai, but it did in Osaka. It didn't happen up in northern Japan either. And we appreciate that. I could never locate those people, though, that befriended us. I tried.
Camp life wasn't that bad. We got parcels. Red Cross deserves a lot of credit for keeping me alive there. And I continue to remember them with periodic contributions. The Red Cross parcel had enough basic food in, even without what the Germans gave you, probably to keep you, it would keep you alive and in reasonable physical shape. The Germans gave us potatoes and hot water for coffee in the morning with they gave you ersatz stuff, you know. The bread was black bread, and I didn't. First time I got it when in the farmhouse, I didn't like it, but then it tasted like cake after a few months. They marched us out when the Russians got within about 15 miles, and that was the worst experience. The 3 weeks on the road, and then finally into boxcars. And I remember walking along, crying, and I got mad. I said, "You're not going to kill me like this." I had frozen tears on my face. I was just exhausted. And it was always 6 more kilometers to go. We were told not to escape. The colonel said, "You will be, you could be court-martialed if you escape," because he said the Germans have SS men on the perimeters, and especially the Hungarian SS. If they pick you up, they just shoot you. He said, "So you are under orders not to escape." I got down to a little town called Gamelsdorf, and I could hear the artillery. I could hear 105s or whatever they were, 155s, and I knew the Americans were coming. And I said, "Geez, I'm just going to stay here. I'm not going to." And we were told the next morning we were going to go into the permanent camp, and then the capper was that was the day that we were told by laughing Germans that Roosevelt is dead. Roosevelt is tot. Ha ha. And that. I'd never lost a president before. But I said to myself, I'm tired of this. I don't want to go back into another camp. The American Army is going to be here in the next couple of days. I'll just stay behind. After 2 days, the artillery stopped, and I said, "Oh, they swung somewhere else, and I'm going to run out of food here, and I'm going to have to give myself up, and I don't want to do that because they'll kill me." And so I said, "Well, I know where I am, and I know where I have to go." And so over the next 10 or 12 days, I walked about 120 kilometers down to Kempten and Dornbirn, and finally got down to the and there's a point of Switzerland that is joined by Germany and Austria, and it's very mountainous, and you travel valleys, but there are signposts that tell you where you are, and again there's so many refugees. There's thousands of Germans moving around trying to get out of the Russian zone. That there's just mass confusion. The only problem I had in traveling that is that I didn't have any papers, and I couldn't walk across a bridge. So what do you do when you can't walk across a bridge? You have to swim the river. So I was always wet, and there's nothing as wet as a GI overcoat. You can take your shirt off and dry your pants out, but that coat never dries. And I swam 4 rivers. Finally got down to the border, and I knew it was the border into Switzerland because I knew it was the Rhine River, and there was a barbed wire on the German side, substantial barbed wire, double system with tangle wire in the middle. Watched the German guards and their dogs walking, so I used the same, and they would walk it at 4 o'clock, and then they would walk it the next morning. And I said, I got to get out of here. And if I'm going to do it, I'm going to get out at night. So I got down to the wire. And of course, then I realized that I didn't exactly know where the Germans had walked. And I started to say, this could be bad, because Germans were known to mine their barbed wire fence systems, either internally as you touch the wire, or mostly in the ground, 3 feet down. So I started to dig, and I didn't have any tools, and I bloodied my hands and got through the first strands. The tangle wire was the worst, because you can't avoid it. You lift it, and just when you think you're out, it's caught your pants, and I ripped myself up quite a bit, and finally got through. And going through the last one, I was so afraid that I was going to die or be caught there and shot that my tongue stuck to the top of my mouth. And that's an awful feeling. I had no moisture in my body. So I was dehydrated, totally fearful. Then I stumbled, ripped my clothes, ripped my head, stumbled into the Rhine River, which isn't a big river at that point. It was probably 100 yards wide, flowing rather swiftly because it's just coming down out of the Alps, and floated, with the flow of the river, and I could touch the ground near the bottom in most places, but I could swim too, and kind of got myself up to the other bank and just kind of collapsed, kind of fitfully passed out. Got up the next morning, all stiff, cold as hell, and stumbled out on this little road and walked along. I didn't know. I just knew I had to go somewhere, rather than just sit there and die. And I was stumbling along this road, and this guy in a bike came roaring around the corner, and he stops and gets off the bike, and he's got a uniform on. It looks like a German uniform, a blue-gray uniform. And I said, oh God, after all this, didn't I get out? I thought maybe I'd cross back in or did some dumb thing. I was really almost delirious at that time. And I kind of stumbled to him, and I said, I got within about 20 feet. I don't know what I look like, but it would be nice to have that picture right now. But he was kind of apprehensive, because I was covered with blood and all sorts of things, mud and wet, miserable. Mean looking, probably. And I said, Ich bin Amerikaner. And this guy said, Je suis.
We were
impounded in Bilibid prison, which is the north edge of Manila. And from there we were taken on up to a railroad station not far from there. And they had little cars, little railroad cars. They called them, they were the size of the French 40 and 8. 40 and 8 being for 40 soldiers or 8 horses. And they put 100 of the prisoners in each one, and then the order came down that they had to put in 15 more. And so with prodding with bayonets and shoving and yelling and screaming, which they did a lot of, they would get in as many more as they could. And then this was in May, and it was very hot in the tropics. And they closed up the doors, and they had boarded up all of the air vents and everything there. And we stayed there through that day, and the air got very bad, and it got very hot, and some of the fellows had dysentery, and you couldn't move around. You just breathe in the face of the one that was facing you. And as fellows would die, they would gradually sink down, and all you could do was stand on them. And it reminded me of back on the farm. In the wintertime, when we'd have late spring bad weather, and little chickens would be under the brooder stove in the little chicken house. And as the young ones would freeze to death, or some of them would freeze to death and die, the others would stand on them and all crowd together to keep warm. And that reminded me of this in that terrible situation in that boxcar. Well, they moved us on up, and eventually we got up to another camp called Cabanatuan. We went up to Camp 3, which was beyond 1 and 2. And we were impounded there, and I recall a lot of the fellows getting bayoneted on the way because they were so weak they couldn't keep up. And they would be screamed at and beat, and as they would collapse, they would be killed. And one of the fellows right at the gate, when they stopped us to inspect us, offered $100 American money for a drink of water, and of course no one had any. And to make his point, he held up a $100 bill and repeated it, and one of the guards saw it, Japanese guards, and came over and jerked his canteen away from him, and he had stuffed it with $100 bills. And so they took him off and, as I said, punished him severely, which meant after they tortured him, they killed him. And then we went on into camp. We were taken by trucks from Camp 1 down to Manila, put back in Bilibid, and then the next day we were marched down to be put in these ships. And the ship that we were put in was an old, very dilapidated ship. I didn't think it would even float. But anyway, we were shoved in there so tight and so close. They would move 100 group in at a time, and it was really packed in there. And we had to go over the gunwale that was about 18 inches high and drop down into this hole, which was probably 16 or 17 feet deep. And if you didn't move fast enough, the guard would just kick you and knock you over into there, and you would fall. And the first hold was filled up, and our group was next to fill in the front hold of the 2 holds in the ship. And so as I went down in there, I noticed the rack at the back, and there were 2 fellows up on it already. And so I crawled up with them, and the rest of them packed in there. And we were on the ship from that time for 2 months getting to Japan. And this was a time when there were a lot of American submarines out there. These were unmarked ships, and they were covered on the deck with contraband from the Philippines, rolls of wire, scrap metal, and things that they could melt down. And so there was no way for the American subs to know that there were prisoners in there. And we would start out to go out into the China Sea out there, and then they would come back in, and back and forth and back and forth. And during this time, they would let down maybe a can of tea, weak tea, or a can of half-cooked rice for all of these hundreds of men. And there was no way that you could get any of it. And if you did get it, you'd probably get into a terrible fight. And it got to the point where men were going stark raving mad. But anyway, the fellow on my right started screaming one night and kicking. And we helped pull his leg back up, and one of the other prisoners had gone completely berserk and was chewing on his toes. And when it got light, we saw that one of his toes had been chewed off and part of the other one, and apparently he was so numb and so paralyzed he didn't realize what was happening until it got quite painful. Anyway, there was a lot of things like that went on those hell ships. And those are things that it's hard for anyone that hears it or reads about it to really realize the condition that existed there. Because in reading it or listening to it, you can't feel the heat, or you can't feel the desperation, or the revert to the animal type that I guess we all are without civilization. But as we docked in Japan proper on the island of Kyushu, the southern island, I don't remember it at all. I was unconscious, but I know that when I came to, I was laying on a cement floor that looked to me like a cowshed, and it had a cement gutter there for like they have behind the stanchioned cows in a cow barn. And some of the other prisoners were there, and they told me that we were now in Japan, and that we were on the southern island. And the next thing I remember was that they were marching us out to get some food. And the interpreter, they had a pretty good interpreter then who we could understand. And he was telling us that now we would be issued warm clothing, and we'd be getting toksan, which was a lot of food, and that we would be now considered as prisoners of war, and we would have the pleasure of being the guest of the emperor, and that we would be assigned to different work details.